Do you know what time it is? In history? Have you noticed anything strange going on lately? Well, there's a guy named Bledsoe who says that we are on the verge of a monumental shift in humanity that will usher in 1,000 years of peace.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
And we're containers. That's how supposedly the aliens look at us.
There would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, a new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
Growing up in the 80s, things were different. For instance, at school, every day after we sang the national anthem, we had to recite the Lord's Prayer. And about once a month, we had to have a religion class, which I hated. It was so boring. But the teacher, I have to say, was a very nice older lady named Mrs. Eden. Kind of the perfect name for a religion teacher, really. She would come to the class, maybe get us to sing a song or two about Jesus. She had little handouts that we could color and fill in the blanks or Bible crossword. And she would always have a big book with illustrations describing the Bible stories that she would talk about. Now, we had this from kindergarten all the way up to grade 8. She would go through the different stories of Jesus with the woman at the well, when Jesus fed the 5,000, and of course the famous walking on water story. Now, out of all of the years that she came and taught us about Christianity, I can hardly remember anything really, except for this one day. I think I was in grade 6, and I remember sitting there at my desk with my head resting in my arms, bored out of my mind, as she's flipping through this big book of illustrations. And she flipped to a page that had an illustration of some adults looking up into the sky. And in the sky, there were some clouds. And in those clouds was Jesus. And I thought, well, that looks kind of strange. And then she proceeded to tell us that they believe that someday Jesus is going to come back to earth, that he's going to be in the clouds, and that the whole world is going to look up and see him, and that the Christians will disappear and be with him in heaven instantly. And I remember thinking, what the hell is she talking about? I thought I must have heard her wrong. There's no way that adults could believe that this is true. Because up until that point, everything that I had seen about Christianity was just in helping you in your afterlife. You'll go to heaven when you die and try and be a good person. But what she was talking about was bringing it up another notch. That there's going to be this inevitable event where the rubber meets the road, where this religion goes from just being a nice idea to something that manifests in this reality. That really impacted me. And it would be about a year or so later that I would start to attend a youth group of a Pentecostal church, where I would hear that message again, except this time they called it the rapture, and they were all about it. I think all the evangelical churches were talking about it in the late 80s. There was a lot of books written about it, and to be honest, it scared the crap out of me, because the way that it was taught to me, and that everyone seemed to believe at the time, that Jesus could come back at any second. And if you were sinning when he was coming back in the clouds, that you would be left behind. And you might think, well, big deal, you're left behind. Well, the problem with that is that after that, the world was supposed to be ruled by this Antichrist, and millions upon millions of people were going to die, and that anyone left on earth after the rapture could never go to heaven, that they could only go to hell. So you can imagine how much that would torment a young kid who buys into this because adults are telling him it's true. My parents never forced me to believe anything. They said that it was up to me to make up my own mind. But there's something about the power of an adult saying something, especially when you're young. So there was a few years that I was tormented. And I remember one day specifically, I was out with my dad for the whole day. And on our way home, I was thinking as we were driving, what if the rapture happened? What if I get home and my brother's gone? I always had that fear in the back of my head. And we would often joke about it in Christian circles. But I remember as I was sitting in the truck worrying about that, I remember going within myself and comforting myself with the fact that I know what's going on. I could feel something deep inside of me that was saying everything's okay. And I did have some peace. So then, I get home, and my brother says to me, "You gotta come into my bedroom. You'll never guess what happened." So I go in his bedroom, and he turns on his stereo, and there's a radio announcer. And this radio announcer is saying that millions of people all over the world have disappeared, and that they think it may have been the rapture. But for me, the timing of that was funny. With the conclusions I had just come to myself in my dad's truck, that it didn't faze me. And then my brother started to laugh. It was just a joke. It was a Christian heavy metal band named Barren Cross. They had just released a new album. In the beginning of one of their songs, they had the news anchor doing the whole rapture bit, and thanks, Chris. But that goes to show you how popular it was in Christian pop culture at the time. In fact, there was a book written by a NASA engineer of all people, and it was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. I mean, talking about laying it all out there. He must have been pretty proud of himself. He figured it out. And the date was right around September 11th. Now that's kind of an interesting date. But as you'll be able to guess, it didn't happen. But that didn't stop him. I guess he figured he must have forgot to carry the one. So he upped it to September 1st, 1989. And then after that didn't happen, he later updated it to 1993. And of course, nothing. But this really does fit a pattern. There's no shortage of stories of religions and cults having some day in the calendar where they say that there's some huge event that's going to happen. There was the famous Heaven's Gates cult. They had a belief that they could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature, and that they would ascend into heaven, referring to it as the next level. And to make a long story short, in 1997, when the comet Hale-Bopp was its closest approach to Earth, the group committed mass suicide. That's pretty disturbing. But they're just one of many. You see, there's this pattern in the human psyche that seems to keep coming up all over the world, over and over and over again, that there is going to be a huge event where basically heaven and earth are going to meet. Well, you know, they may not be 100% wrong. Now, I'm not proposing anybody do anything drastic. I don't think the traditional view of the rapture of Jesus coming down and Christians being evaporated into heaven and this tribulation, I don't believe any of that stuff. But maybe there is something at the basic, the most core part of that belief and many others is something is going to happen. Something huge is going to happen. But we always think of that as a negative. But maybe that's where we've been wrong. Maybe it's a positive. Or well, maybe that depends how you look at it. Now this brings us to a guy named Chris Bledsoe. Now Chris is someone who says that he has a message for the world. His is a message of hope for humanity. That humanity is going to go through a huge awakening. That there is a new knowledge coming to the earth. And that new knowledge is going to usher in 1,000 years of peace. But unfortunately, in order to get to that 1,000 years of peace, we have to go through some trouble first, which is what we're going through right now. You see, he had predicted this back in 2012. That was when he got the main bulk of his message. But the problem is, nobody's quite sure who he's gotten his message from. So Chris, he does not call himself a prophet. He didn't have a dream. He didn't have some prophetic unction or psychic premonition. This message that he got from a being. Actually, he got it from a beautiful woman floating 3 feet off the ground with long, blonde, flowing hair and a Roman type of white robe on with a triangle in her chest. And she looked just as human as you or me. Chris calls her the lady and refers to it as the phenomena. Not an alien, just phenomena. Which is funny, when I look up the definition of the word phenomena and the origin of the word, it just means thing appearing. So I guess that is the perfect word for it. But in order for us to understand the phenomena and the lady, the only way to do that is to look at Chris's story, to look at where he was at in life and what this phenomena has done for him. That's really the only way to understand it. So Chris has written a book called UFO of God, which is a great book, and also a quick search on YouTube, and you'll find all kinds of podcasts where he shares his story in full detail. So I'm going to give a condensed version of where he's from and what he's about, so that we can focus on the message that he's been given to tell everyone. So here we go. So Chris, he's from North Carolina. And he's a guy who had a very successful home building business. He was building 80 to 100 homes a year. He had a wife and 4 kids, a nice big house, investment properties. Compared to a lot of people, he was pretty successful. But things got difficult for Chris when the economy in their area took a downturn. And he was left with a bunch of houses that he couldn't sell. And over the course of a number of years, him trying to make payments on the houses that he couldn't sell eventually drained all of his savings, where he even had to sell his home and move into a mobile home with his family. And the immense amount of stress and burden that was on him for all of those years caused his Crohn's disease that he had had for many years, but stress causes it to flare up, and he got very sick with Crohn's. So sick that even for a matter of time, he couldn't even work at all. And Chris's story touches me because I am a carpenter like Chris, and I struggled with Crohn's disease for 13 years. And I had lost my job. I couldn't work for a couple years at one point. And I know what it is to have a physical job and you're trying to build things and you have to run to the bathroom 20 times a day. It's embarrassing. It's very difficult. You're dragging your feet all the time. I remember I used to complain and I would say, I'm just sick enough to look like a slacker. And I know the pain when you've lost your health and you've lost control over your finances. It's the ultimate defeated feeling, especially for a man. We want to be the providers for our family. We want to be the symbol of strength, physically and financially. And when you've lost control of that and have people that you love with all of your heart dependent on you, it's very difficult. And that's where Chris was. That's where he was mentally in January of 2007. He was very sick. His dad had actually convinced him to try and just work on a job that he had working with a construction crew out on the coast building a house. And so he did. He got through it and he got that job done. And the crew that he worked with wanted to celebrate by having him take them fishing. He had a 4x4 and they needed it to get to go where they wanted to go fishing. So he said, okay. His wife was out of town with his 3 other kids. So he and his oldest, Chris Jr., he was about 17. They went with the other guys fishing. Chris wasn't really in much of a fishing mood that day, considering his difficult circumstances he was in. So he had set them up. They had started a fire by the riverbed, and he went for a walk back in the woods. He wanted to climb up a hill, and there's a field up there. He wanted to see if he could see any deer or coyotes. And as he wandered through the woods that late afternoon, he says that he was crying out to God. How am I going to take care of my family? I'm sick. I can barely work. At the time, he was 45 years old. He had come from running a business that did millions of dollars a year in sales, to owning an 8,000 square foot $1 million home with a pool, to living in a mobile home and applying for a program to provide his kids lunches at school. So you can imagine the frustration and sense of loss and despair. And that's a very important part of this story. You see, he says that the phenomena is something that is with us in the most difficult times of our life. And he believes that the reason he had the encounter that day is because he was crying out to God for help. And that reminds me of all the verses in the Bible that say, God is near to all of those who call upon him. But the question is, what is your definition of God? And maybe that's the problem with Chris's story, is that we have our definition of God wrong. Let's get back to Chris. So Chris was walking by himself in the woods as the sun was going down, and he climbed up this hill. And when he peered up this hill into the field, he saw the sun. And then as he climbed up higher, he saw another sun. And of course he realized those aren't suns, but they were burning orbs, red orange, and they were maybe 50 feet in diameter. And he was afraid. And he ducked down in the grass, and he thought he better run back to the camp. And as he was getting ready to run back, he looked up in the sky, and he saw one fly over top of him. And then the next thing he remembers is he's walking up to the campfire, which is now just a bunch of orange embers. And he says to the guys that were there, "You're never going to guess what I saw." And they were shocked to see him. They were saying, "Where have you been? You've been gone for 4 hours." And Chris was sure that he was only gone for 20 minutes. He then realized that his son wasn't there. And they told him that he went looking for him like an hour or two ago. And they couldn't find him. So they went all searching through the woods. And Chris found his son, and his son was in shock. His son had encountered those same orbs. Except he saw some beings. These were little, like 3, 4 foot tall beings. Their skin was like a glowing moon, and they had red eyes, kind of like that would look like brake lights on a car. And he was so terrified that he went into shock, and he couldn't speak or say anything. So Chris got him, they regrouped and went back to the truck. And as they were getting into the truck, one of the guys pointed up to some lights that were flying around in the sky. Looked like a bunch of stars, like brighter than Venus. And they were flying around, and they started to come closer and closer towards them. And Chris realized those were the same orbs or ships that he saw. Except this time, when he saw them, he wasn't afraid. He said he was more curious than anything, and really he wanted to have a closer look. But the guys with him were totally freaked out. They got into the truck, and they were begging him to floor it. He said he couldn't go fast enough for the guys. They thought it was the end of the world. And in his truck, they were fighting over who would get dropped off first so they could see their families and say goodbye or be with them as this happens. And as they're driving, the orb is over top of them. Chris said at one point it was 50 feet above his truck, and it flew right over them and took off like a gunshot. And then something strange happened. Well, as if this wasn't strange enough. There is a very sharp corner he had to drive around. They call it a dead man's corner, where you have to slow down, and if you're doing even 35 miles an hour, you could lose control. Very sharp. And as he's slowing down to drive around that corner, he sees the orb there again. And it's floating over one particular spot. And this is where it gets strange. Because on this corner, right where the orb was hovering over top of that particular spot, that spot was where Chris's first wife was killed when her car flipped over. He had gotten married pretty young, and he was married to this woman for 11 months before her tragic death. And he had always blamed himself for that night, that he should have been there and that it wouldn't have happened. And when he saw the orb hovering over that spot, it's like it spoke to him telepathically. And it said he didn't have to feel guilty, that it wasn't his fault. And then he had the image, and he said it was like he relived the moment all over again. And then the guilt left him. He had carried that guilt for years, and he could feel that it was released from him. So as his friends are totally freaked out and scared for their lives, he's having this peace from the phenomenon heal him in his heart. So he continued on driving. He dropped his friends off, and him and his son went home for the night. Of course, as soon as they got into the house, his son was locking all the doors and closing all the blinds and curtains on the windows. I don't blame him. And then they started to hear some dogs bark. Chris's dad has a bunch of hunting dogs that he would train, and those dogs were going crazy. And not barking like it was a deer, but you can tell when a dog barks and it's scared. He heard a lot of scared dogs barking. So he took his dog and he went outside because his dad, who lived beside him, had a garage there that Chris had a lot of tools and stuff in that garage, and he didn't want anything to get stolen. So he walked over there and he could see his dad's dogs, and they were all looking into the woods at something. So Chris sent his dogs into the woods to try and flush whatever it was out, and he went running as fast as he could to the other side of the woods because he wanted to see if it was a bear or a coyote, or who knows, maybe someone that was trying to break into the garage. And when he came flying around the corner, he saw a being. He saw the same being that his son saw earlier. It was about a 3.5 foot tall, little glowing being with a triangle on his chest and red eyes. He said really it looked like a 4-year-old child. And his face, it didn't look like a gray alien face, but it definitely wasn't human. And it was glowing like the moon. He came within 4 feet of this little thing, and when he saw it, obviously it scared the crap out of him. I mean, it's gotta be a really bizarre feeling seeing a being that isn't human, that's not from this dimension. So he thought he was dead. He thought that's it. And he started backing up against a tree. And he said, "I surrender. I mean you no harm." And then he heard a voice say, "You don't understand. We are not here to hurt you. We're here to help you." And at that moment, his dog comes barreling through the woods. And then the being disappeared. So Chris went back to the house, and they locked everything up, and his son made sure all the blinds were pulled down. And back then, Chris was a smoker, so as you can imagine, he was dying for a cigarette. So he went into his office, and he was gonna lift the blinds, open a window so he could have a smoke and just blow the smoke outside. And his son, standing there, begged him not to open the window. But he said, "It'll be fine." And he started to lift the blinds, and he got them lifted about halfway, and he sees a being. Now, about 60 feet away from his window was a 7-foot tall, human-like looking being. He said it was similar looking to maybe a gray alien, except it had tan skin, and its eyes looked human, except they would be bigger than what we have. So, of course, he closed the blinds, and he didn't tell his son what he saw, but they went and got into his pickup truck, drove about 5 miles down the road into a big open hayfield, and parked there until the sun came up. And in the morning, they went back home. And after a while, Chris noticed that his stomach was feeling pretty good, which I can attest having Crohn's in the morning is when your stomach feels the worst. And he had a daily medication that he had to take, or it would throw him off. And he didn't take it that day because he felt so good. And after that day, he was completely healed of Crohn's disease, and he has never had a symptom since. So you can imagine the excitement he had from seeing the orbs and spaceships the night before to seeing these beings, having his heart healed from the death of his first wife, and now his long battle with Crohn's was seemingly over with all of his symptoms going away. And to this day, they have never come back. So he did what I would have done. He told everybody. Chris was a deacon at a Pentecostal church. They had gone to, him and his wife and his family, for many years. And of course, he told everyone about his experience and how his Crohn's was healed. But unfortunately, Chris's experience doesn't line up with our traditional Bible narrative that we've been told. And so Chris's powerful spiritual experience with this phenomena and his healing of his body and of his heart was seen by his fellow church members and people in the community as demons. Which is kind of strange because there isn't any cases in the Bible of a demon healing somebody. And given the fact that Jesus said you will know them by their fruits, it kind of doesn't add up. I mean, clearly, the fruit from this experience was healing of the heart and the body. But of course, God forbid somebody have an experience that doesn't line up with the traditional Christian narrative. So he was ridiculed. He was made fun of. He was the talk of the church, but not only that, he was the talk of the town. His kids were made fun of at school and even bullied. Even he talks about there were some teachers that even made fun of them. But this is where Chris's story is different. I mean, he will not be the first person to have a UFO alien experience and to be ridiculed by it and become the talk of the town. But Chris is different because that experience he had never stopped. It wasn't just on January 7th and 8th. He continued to see the lights over his house at nighttime, to be woken up in the night and walk outside and to see orbs, even shadow beings in his home and around his home. And eventually his children started to see them and his wife. Now Chris's heart was healed and the Crohn's disease was gone, but he was plagued with these headaches that he would get anytime he tried to really think about what happened or tried to talk about it. And sometimes when he would try, these headaches would come on so strong that he would pass out. So he eventually gets led to a psychologist who is able to do a hypnotic regression on him. Now that's a technique where they hypnotize you and then they walk you through the trauma to help release it from our mind and our body. And by doing this hypnotic regression, it relieved him of his headaches, so he was able to think and talk about it again with no issues. But when they walked him through that regression, back through the night of January 7th and what happened, the information they got was wild. So listen to what they found out. Here it goes. The beings Chris encountered on the night of January 7th are pure energy. That they care about us and that they're with us in times of trouble. That they speak in a silent voice telepathically. They work for creation. and that they've watched over his family for generations. They also travel to different worlds and dimensions because there is not just one universe. Their home is just a second away. They came to Earth to learn balance, and it's like a garden to them. They balance all existing life of all kinds and measure and details, and they've been doing it for eons. And those small little beings him and his son saw are their children. And that night they had just let them out to play. They wear a suit for protection until a certain age when they learn to use their abilities. And also that these beings can travel anywhere through time and other dimensions. Wow. Like, what are we even supposed to do with that? That's a real different take about what's going on and how reality works. But that whole thought that we're overseen by interdimensional beings is not a new thought at all. That idea is all through the Bible of angels and demons, rulers and principalities. I think just the only difference is we've just pictured really good-looking, muscular beings with wings protecting us, angels. But maybe they are skinny, 7-foot-tall creatures with big eyes. I don't know. But this whole idea was something that Plato talked about. Now listen to this. In his book of Critics, he writes that in the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment, and that there was no quarreling because you cannot rightly suppose the gods did not know what was proper for each of them to have, and that all of them by just appointment obtained what they wanted and peopled their own districts. When they had peopled them, they tended us, their nurslings and possessions, as shepherds tended their flocks, excepting only that they did not use blows for bodily force as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of a vessel, which is an easy way of guiding animals, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus they did guide all mortal creatures. That paints quite the picture. Holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Boy, that's quite the thought. And in Plato's Laws, he writes, Kronos is aware of the fact that no human being is capable of having responsible control of all human affairs without becoming filled with pride and injustice. So pondering this fact, he then appointed as kings and rulers for our cities, not men, but beings of a race that was more noble and more divine, namely demons. And Kronos acted as we now do in the case of sheep and herds of tame animals. We do not set oxen as rulers over oxen or goats over goats, but we who are of a nobler race ourselves rule over them. And in like manner, God in his love for humanity set over us at that time a nobler race of demons, who with much comfort to themselves and much to us took charge of us, and furnished peace for us, and modesty, and orderliness, and justice, and thus made the tribes of men free from feuds and happy. Now, before you start freaking out thinking we're ruled over by demons, that word didn't always mean something super evil. The original meaning of the word demon was a supernatural being or a spirit. And Plato lived about 2,400 years ago. So this idea has been around for a very long time. So the beings that Chris saw on that January evening, were these the same beings Plato was talking about? Beings that work for creation? They told Chris that they balance existing life of all kinds and measure and details, and that they've been doing this for eons, that they can travel anywhere through time and space, and that they speak in a silent voice, telepathically. Now, I don't know about you, but when I heard the phrase that they speak in a silent voice, I know what that means. That's something I've had many times throughout my life. A silent voice inside of me that has given me direction, or hope, or ideas. In Christianity, they call it the still small voice. So maybe this is just a practical way of how it happens, that there are higher dimensional beings that watch over us and work for creation. Another term for them would be the custodians of the earth. And now you're thinking, well, if they're the custodians of the earth, they are not doing a very good job. Well, I don't know. Have you ever tended to a flock of sheep? I haven't, and I don't really know much about it. But when you're dealing with an animal, they have free will. They can do whatever they want. So it's not always easy to control something that has free will. And I imagine that would be the same with us. That is something I've heard come up time and time again, that these higher dimensional beings, that the universe really is really into free will, and they will not violate ours. So that means they need us to work with them. They won't force us to do anything. But remember what Plato said. He said that those beings tend to us as shepherds tend to their flocks, accepting only that they did not use blows for bodily force as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of a vessel, which is an easy way of guiding animals, holding on our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their pleasure. The thought that comes to mind when I read that is, have you ever worked with somebody who is very stubborn, and in order to get them to do something, you have to make them think it's their idea? Maybe that's kind of how they try to steer humanity. Who knows? But as far as Chris's experience with beings go, we're just getting started. I mean, this one we've been talking about is only his first, and he's had many more. Now, we're going to fast forward to Easter of 2012. Chris was at a point in his life where he was extremely frustrated. Him and his whole family would see the orbs and the beings. They say it was almost like they lived in a haunted house. But nobody outside of his family could experience any of this stuff. And after a while, it began to wear on him. He was frustrated with the beings because what is he supposed to do? Encounter all of this stuff? Tell people? And he can't prove it or show anybody? So he went outside and he yelled at the heavens one night, "I'm done. The amount of pain you're causing my family, they get made fun of with the talk of the town." He had had enough. So he yelled at the heavens and he went to bed. And then, in the middle of the night, he was woken up by this thunderous voice that said, "Arise." And at the foot of his bed, he could see those shadow beings that he was so used to, seeing around his house all the time. They were standing at the foot of his bed. And he said he's not sure exactly what happened, but he was in some type of trance-like state. So he just put all of his clothes on, and he walked out into the backyard with them. And as they were walking through his backyard, one of these beings turned around and gave him a ball of fur or something. He said it felt kind of like a hedgehog, a little bit prickly, but there was no head and there was no tail, but it definitely felt like it was alive. It kind of scared him, so he dropped it. And the being said, "You have to pick it up. This is yours. You have to keep this." So he bent over to pick it up, and then they were gone. So there he is holding this weird ball of fur porcupine type thing. So he went over and he put it in his dog kennel. And when he was walking away from the kennel, he felt this mighty wind. But not like a regular wind that's blowing everything and trees all over around him. This was like a localized wind. And he saw a type of black hole open up in front of him. And that's where the wind was coming from. And then out of that black hole came running straight for him was a huge 1,500-pound bull. Except this was kind of translucent. And he fell on his back, and it ran right over top of him. But when it was over top of him, he could see right through it and see the stars. And as he was trying to get his bearings and get up and run back to the house, he saw a woman. She was about 6 feet away from him and floating 3 feet off the ground. She had a long white Roman type dress on that would like shimmer as it was flowing in the wind. And he said she was beautiful beyond measure. And that she looked as real as you or I. She wasn't translucent or have some sort of light shining through her. She looked like she was made of flesh and blood. And she gave him a message. She said there's trouble coming to Earth and that they need to wake people up. And they were going to use Chris to help them. And that they want to use Chris to introduce them to the world. And then she said something very strange. She said when the star Regulus faces the Sphinx at dawn, that a new knowledge will be revealed to humanity. She then went on to tell him that there has been a shift in the powers of the heavens, and that the feminine energy has not been on Earth, or however that works, but the feminine energy is coming back, and nobody can stop it. And that this shift will happen when we move into the age of Aquarius. That's when the divine feminine will come back to Earth, and it will be the dominant energy, and it will give us 1,000 years of peace. But before that peace could happen, we were going to have to go through some trouble. And he was shown images in his mind, I guess, of the trouble that potentially could, and some of it that would come. And you know, one of the things that he was shown back in 2012 is that when Israel bombs Iran and Syria, that we would be right in the middle of it. That those would be the signs that something new is on its way. And that we just had to get to the other side of this trouble. And then we'll be on our way to 1,000 years of peace. Now, having this wild experience really encouraged Chris and helped him have more desire to go out there and to tell the message that this lady gave him. And a week after this happened, he started getting speaking opportunities where he was able to share about this and other experiences. And that caught some strange attention, not from the whole UFO crowd, but from the government. When they heard about the lady and the bull, they got very interested. He had NASA and a whole bunch of 3-letter agencies coming out wanting to meet him and to interview him. He's even put everything I've shared with you and more down in writing for top Pentagon officials. He also had the Vatican interested in what he had to say, which is very interesting. I mean, it was the lady and the bull that he said they were really interested in. You think they would be going on about the ships or the technology. But my question is, are we that out of sync with reality that the lady and the bull mean nothing to us? Is that because we just really don't understand what's going on? Why is the government so interested in the lady and the bull? I mean, it's kind of unnerving, really. And I've heard Chris say in other interviews that one of the reasons they're interested in him is because they know the lady exists, but they can't talk to her. She won't talk to them. Now back to the star Regulus facing the Sphinx at dawn whole thing. Well, that's interesting because they've put it through computer programs that track astrological events, and it turns out that Easter 2026, the star Regulus will be in the gaze facing the Sphinx at dawn. And that's when the lady said a new knowledge will be revealed to the entire earth. Now the question is, what is that new knowledge? Wait a minute. This kind of sounds like the whole rapture thing a little bit. Maybe you could just call it a worldwide religious or spiritual event. Now, to get really weird, I want you to Google the National Space Intelligence Center. That was started in 2022, and their patch or insignia is a picture of the Sphinx staring at a star at dawn. The government knows. They know what's going on. And I've listened to different CIA and other government officials who have spoken out. And they've said that there's chatter in certain areas of the government of this date 2027. That something big is going to happen in 2027. There's even been rumors that something is headed towards Earth, and that's going to be here in 2026 or 2027. Well, according to the lady, the divine feminine's coming back to Earth, that's for sure. However that looks. And this is funny because the only way to try to understand this is we have to think about spiritual things. This is not nuts and bolts UFO stuff of technology and gray aliens and doing experiments and abductions. This is something spiritual. The fact that NASA and the Vatican are interested in this is just, it's a real head scratcher. Whatever happened to science and religion don't mix? Well, maybe that's not true. I mean, the founding fathers of NASA were heavily into the occult. So maybe we just don't understand how things really work. Which the deeper I look into this stuff, the more I'm convinced that that is the case. And it feels like that the world is on a collision course with having to face the reality that the spiritual realm is real. That they can't hide it anymore. And they're going to be confronted with that they have to tell us the truth about what's actually going on here. That we are in the Truman Show. And there's a lot of fake things that we've believed. You know, and there's a saying that it's easier to fool somebody than it is to convince them They've been fooled. It reminds me of a time in the Bible when Jesus was scolding the religious leaders. And he said to them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And when it is the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." Can you tell what time it is? Everyone I talk to, every single day, it's nothing in conversation to comment about how weird everything is right now. To say in a passing conversation, "Strange times." Isn't that how you tell what time it is? When everyone in the world agrees that strange things are happening? I think that's how you tell. So I'm sure we all agree on that. Strange times, I'm sure nobody's arguing with me. But the question is, what do we do? Do we hunker down and grab on to old belief systems as hard as we can? Or is it time to be honest with ourselves and let go of things that aren't serving us? Well, it's hard to let go of something when you're afraid. Well, the lady talked to Chris about that. She talked to him about fear because Chris has seen the lady many more times over the years. He's gotten a lot more information from her, and he's shared, I think, a lot of it with everybody. Well, she told him to never look at fear, to never talk negativity, never bring it into our lives, to remove it from us completely, to stop this negative vibration from going on. Our vibration is linked to her, the lady, and it's linked to the earth. And when we live in fear, our vibration drops to a lower level and throws every living thing off. Every tree, every plant, every creature on the whole planet, its vibration is off, and the planet is beginning to shake and self-destruct. That this process has already started, and only we can stop it. She said that with love, we can awaken to a new era, a new world of peace, which has been prophesied for thousands of years. But she stressed we have to never give in to fear. She said that they want us to awaken before it's too late, and that many more are lost, and that she weeps and groans over creation of what will happen if we don't let go of our fear. She told him that fear blinds us. You know, and maybe that's what was blinding the religious leaders that Jesus was scolding when he was telling them, "Can't you see the signs of the times?" Maybe it's fear that blinds us. Because in order to face what's going on, in order to face the fear, we may have to deal with some issues in our own lives, in our own belief systems. And that can be extremely painful. Imagine giving decades of your life to an ideology that had a lot wrong with it and even hurt people. That's a terrible feeling. I know it. I've been there. But she said that we have to shed all pride and greed and humble ourselves, and that's how we find the higher place. That's how we ascend. But she warned that fear energizes negative entities, that they are alive off of our negative energy in almost a parasitic way, and that these dark forces that we energize are more active now than ever. They're scheming to try and take away our love. They want us to live in fear. The lady also said that the rulers of this planet, they are trying to make biblical scriptures take place. With Israel in the Middle East and Russia, the bear of the north, the war of Gog and Magog. These are not organic things that are happening, but these are people in power trying to make this happen. They're using the Bible as a script to follow. Because when they do that, they are working with the people's own belief systems. But we're not alone. That there are good beings that live in the sea, in the ocean, and that they protect us. That they are benevolent, they watch over us, but they stay out of sight, and they tend to every living thing that walks or crawls or swims. She also told him that there are many other worlds and dimensions, and that the spirits of our loved ones exist among us. And you're probably wondering now, who is this lady again? How does she know this? Well, she told him that she is the manifestation of the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, the Divine Mother. In the Bible, the Holy Spirit is called the Comforter. And it's kind of interesting that in the Bible, the word for the Holy Spirit actually is feminine. And yet I never heard that in all of my years in Christianity. That is a feminine, and they would call the Holy Spirit he or it, but never in the feminine. So she has been gone in our awareness. But now, this divine feminine energy is coming back, and that she loves all of creation, every living thing. She's had many names throughout history, but it's kind of like she's been gone for a while. He said in her presence, he felt love and euphoria. But it always comes back to that the age is changing. So there's something about her connection to the age of Aquarius and the consciousness of humanity and the earth. And that each individual has a part to play through raising their own vibration to one of love and not one of fear. Fear is a crazy thing. When we are afraid, we lose the ability to critically think effectively. Find me a religion that doesn't use fear as a motivator. Or a cult for that matter. Fear is used to control and masked as safety. I'm convinced that our reality is a mirror and that it reflects back to us whatever we give it. If you are looking at yourself in the mirror and you want your reflection to smile, you don't go up to the mirror and try to grab your mouth and make it smile. It's impossible. The only way for you to get your reflection to smile is for you to smile first. And there's nothing that we can do to change that. That is a fundamental law of this realm. So that's why we need to let go of fear. To never give in to fear. Reminds me of that old Roosevelt quote. The only thing to fear is fear itself. Another quote I like is, the only thing fear protects is the unconscious nature that imagines it. So what is that unconscious nature that imagines fear? I guess it's negativity. And it exists from our very own energy. And there are people or beings for that matter, they're aware of this and they use it for their own advantage. But we can stop that. It's our own energy they're using anyways. It's hard to control someone who is not afraid. So I guess if we put all of our energy into not being afraid, that's the answer. But what it really means in a practical way is don't buy into fear ideology. It plays more on emotion than facts. And it always comes down to, at some point or another in fear ideology, where the idea is more important than people. Maybe it's not your people, or your religion, or your ethnicity, but there's someone down the line who ends up that idea is more important than them. And this message reminds me of episode 1 I did, Starman, with the British Southern Television interruption, where Vrillon from the Ashtar Galactic Command interrupted the Saturday evening news with this message about peace and love, but also a warning for humanity. And one of the things he said was that our inner divine self will protect us, and that we must learn to be sensitive to the voice within that can tell us what is truth, what is confusion, and what is untruth. And that if we learn to listen to the voice of truth that is inside of us, that we will lead ourselves onto the path of evolution. I mean, don't you think that's good news? That we don't have to be afraid? That we don't have to give in to fear? And I always thought it was funny with the gospel. That word means good news. And how the good news that I was told was that Jesus died for our sins, and if we ask him into our hearts and to forgive us, that we won't burn in hell for all of eternity. And that anyone who doesn't say that prayer is forever lost. How is that message good news? Well, guess what? I accidentally found out that that's not true. That was never the message of Jesus. In fact, it turns out hell's not even real, that it was added. Of course it was added. But the true meaning of that word, the gospel, I've heard some say, and this really resonates with me, it doesn't mean good news. It means too good to be true. You know what's too good to be true? There is no hell. That there's nothing wrong with us. That's too good to be true, because I guarantee you, if you preach that message, hardly anybody will believe it, because we've been so conditioned. There's a guy named Bob Lazar. He was a whistleblower in the 80s. He's the reason why we know about Area 51. He worked there for a short time. And nobody's quite sure if he's telling the truth. You never know. But there's something that he says that I really vibe with. He said that he saw a thick book that is extremely classified, and it's on religion. I think that's probably true. And I bet you it probably talks about some of the stuff that we've been talking about right now. And I imagine something about how fear ideologies dumb us down and make us more easily controlled. But that was quite the earful, I know. Maybe I've convinced you, maybe I haven't, but either way, I think it is something to think about. We're all on our own journey, and each one of us has to work out this for ourselves. You can't do anybody else's homework for them. So, I'm going to leave you with the last page of Chris's book, which I highly recommend buying, UFO of God. I'm going to leave you with one of the last things he says in this book. He said that all that we need to do is to humble ourselves before the heavens. Simply go outside, look up, connect your heart and mind as one. Humble yourself out loud and say, I am here. God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, did not make it difficult to connect. You don't have to follow some set of formal instructions or rules, learning fancy words and acronyms to experience the phenomena. It is between you and God. Just pick one spot in the night sky, surrender yourself, and say, I am here.